honor your father and mother, that it may go well for you. Now, that doesn't mean that your parents are all going to be good parents. I know that some of you listening even may have had parents who abandoned you, who were abusive, who are still toxic. And yet what God is saying is there is a way to honor and respect them, even as you put up boundaries that will lead to your flourishing. I think because it's our heart that learns how to discern, but also how to submit to authority. And as we grow, we gain wisdom to know, hey, this is not a safe relationship, so I'm going to remove myself versus this is a healthy relationship.
Yeah.
But I think by telling people you're your own God, by telling people that like, hey, your parents are just like kind of your friends and they're just there to guide and direct you and fund your life, we've actually left a whole generation to be a moral wasteland.
Hi, welcome to Wild and Beautiful. We're Joanna Hyatt and Lauren Enriquez, your co-hosts who every week are helping you live out your faith in a way that's biblically rooted but culturally relevant. Testing 1, 2, 3. Is the mic cooperating this week?
We hope. We apologize, friends.
Yeah, last week something went off the rails. I promise I checked my mic before we started. And at some point, another mic in my computer took over. And bad audio. We do really try to give you guys a good, high quality podcast.
We are grateful for all of you that do listen. Those of you that comment, I just want to say thank you for those of you that take the time. I know it's a little awkward at times to spend 30 seconds writing something, but shout out to those who have put down on Apple, because apparently you can't comment on Spotify, but who have reviewed us on Apple and just said, hey, thanks for the time you take. Thanks for making it fun, but also informative. For instance, someone wrote and told us they were listening to us while they traveled to Australia. Like, yes, I will be your travel podcast. That's fantastic. So thank you for that. And if you haven't, now's a good time to rate or review us. Takes, again, just 30 seconds, and it helps ensure that more people get to hear our fantastic audio.
Good to hear. Where are we going with this?
No, good to hear the great content. Hopefully, great content, friends. This week, we're talking about honor and respect and authority, which sounds so fun, but trust me, it will be. And there was 2 news stories in the last couple of weeks that prompted us to want to do this have this conversation. So, Lauren, I'll let you take the first one, and then I'll take the second story.
Yes. So the first story that we are looking at this week, you guys have probably seen it, but Stanford Law School, I think their Federalist Society invited Judge Kyle Duncan from the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals to come and speak to their Federalist Society group. If you know anything about the Federalist Society, you know it leans conservative, and it's kind of the target of a lot of, shall we say, woke counter organizations on college campuses in general, law school specifically. And so, not too surprising, there was a protest of Judge Kyle Duncan's
Was it a peaceful protest?
Well, I guess that depends whether words are violence or not, because I don't think any physical violence was done. To my knowledge, I could not be aware of it. But the judge just couldn't deliver his talk. These students wouldn't let him. And so he asked for an administrator to come and quiet down the crowds and let him exercise his free speech rights for all the Federalist Society students who were there, who wanted to hear him speak and who had invited him to speak. So the administrator, or at least one of the administrators who showed up, did the opposite. She affirmed what the students shouting down the speaker were saying. She accused him of causing harm for his by having conservative beliefs, by having rulings that were aligned with the law and the Constitution. And so a couple of other judges have weighed in on the heels of this situation, and they have said, it's actually a really bad idea for law schools to create animosity with judges because I guess in case the law schools forgot, judges do pick their law clerks, which is a very desirable job coming out of law school. They pick their law clerks in part based on their relationship with a law school. And so I don't think Judge Duncan is going to be inclined to choose a student from Stanford after this situation. And it was just a reminder that we have a society where free speech is valued and that people are allowed to protest, but there is also decorum and a respect for authority that we can't lose in the process of exercising our free speech. There is a point at which you do have to say, okay, I was heard, and now I'm going to let the talk proceed. And that just didn't happen. Fortunately, though, and this is kind of a separate comment, but that administrator who didn't help with the situation at Stanford has been placed on leave, which is an encouraging sign, because I feel like a year ago even, you never would have seen a diversity, equity, and inclusion administrator placed on leave for shouting down a federal judge. She would have been applauded and probably given a raise and a promotion.
Well, let's be clear. She's a dean. She's not like the secretary of the department that was there. She's a dean, and she had 7 minutes of prepared comments. So she fully expected, these kids to do this and then to be ready to talk. So she planned for disruption. And again, the irony is that these words get thrown out of tolerance and diversity and inclusion. And yet it's really only a tolerance of the ideas that a group agrees with.
That's a good
It's only a diversity of ideas that are not that different, as long as they don't make us uncomfortable or face not even truth, just face an opinion and to determine if it's truth. And there's no inclusion. That's the irony of it too. It's like
it's exclusive.
We want to exclude everybody who doesn't perfectly fit our definition. At this point, like, you can be super woke one day and then the next day you're not woke enough. And so it's really hard to keep up on, like, are you in or are you out? So I do applaud Stanford for having done that, because when they first issued their apology, admittedly, I was like, nah, it's going to be another lame apology, and nothing happens. And the dean of the law school has stood by her statement and by putting this woman on leave, even after other students have criticized her apology. I think the tide, as we pointed out in our pop culture episode, the tide is starting to turn, and people are starting to realize, man, this is actually not a good way forward for the institutions. And it's not a good way forward for those kids.
No.
Yeah, they don't think about their future, or as some of these judges have said, like, well, maybe we just need to stop hiring then from entire law schools, because we don't know if we're going to get somebody who has issues with authority and is disruptive or not. And so now you hurt everybody who comes from Stanford.
Yeah, I thought about that. I thought about these students who were so disruptive, who made Stanford look so bad. They didn't just do that to themselves. They did that to the reputation of every other graduating law student that's now going to have that mar on the reputation of their alma mater when they go and try to seek out a clerkship.
And this isn't the first time it's happened, by the way. This has happened numerous times, as Lauren pointed out. Another instance where Federalist Society brought in a speaker was over at Yale, Kristen Wagner, who's with Alliance Defending Freedom. She has argued multiple cases in front of the Supreme Court, by the way.
She's a pretty smart lady.
She's very smart, very accomplished. And again, even if you don't agree with a person's positions, to be able to acknowledge, like, this person has worked hard, advanced through the ranks through her experience, through her intellect, like, maybe she has something to say. And it's funny because it was a free speech panel. Again, the
irony.
And they had to call in like 4 armed guards to protect her. And I just keep thinking, like, you all realize how childish you look, right? As you're doing this, it doesn't make you look more open-minded to shout down somebody who might have some wisdom to speak. You don't have to take it all, but
and there's something to be said too for, okay, maybe you're not going in with an open mind to learn from this person, but at least let them talk so you can hear their position and effectively counter it if you don't agree. Like, what are you even arguing with if you don't even listen long enough for the person to state their position?
And that leads us to the second instance. So the second thing that prompted this conversation was our family was actually watching soccer. So in our house, we're big soccer fans, or if you're a real soccer fan, it's football. And my husband's a diehard Manchester United fan, to the point where like when we meet people and they're like, oh, I like soccer. He goes, who do you root for? And that will determine whether there's even a possibility of friendship. So I usually am standing behind him being like, not these teams if you want to be in our life.
Yeah. Manchester United, there's another Manchester team, right? And they're like,
it's Manchester
rivals.
City.
City. Okay.
Fail. Yeah.
And this causes like blood in the streets in England, right?
Oh, yes. Liverpool's the worst between, for Manchester United, but yes, it causes problems. So we're watching this game between Manchester United and Fulham, and Manchester United was down. They were down by 1 point. They were limited. They only had 10 men on the field. Which is like 40
points in soccer if you don't watch.
I mean, listen, it's a good game. The games usually end with like 2 to 3 points. A real blowout is somebody gets 5 to 7. Then it's painful.
I've never actually watched a game. Well, maybe in the World Cup, but yeah, no, that's wild.
There's not a lot of points happening. It's not like, right now with March Madness wrapping up and whatnot, it's not like you're scoring in the 10s to maybe 100, like breaking the 100. If you break 100, you've had a game that's gone way too long.
Yeah.
So we're down. And then all of a sudden, one of the guys on the Fulham team gets a handball, like clearly sticks out his hand for a handball. And so the ref calls it. And before, though, they finalize the call, he gets told, like, let's go replay the video just to confirm. So again, nothing has actually been decided. He's walking over to confirm whether or not the decision is the right one. Sort of like somebody getting up to give a speech. They actually haven't said anything yet. And immediately the manager of Fulham reacts like really aggressively. He gets a red card, which means the manager's out for 3 games. He's not allowed to be down on the field for the next 3 games. I think I'm getting this right. My husband's either going to be so proud or so disappointed in me. And then as this guy's walking over, another player gets in his face and proceeds to push the ref. You do not touch the ref in soccer, right? He gets a red card. And I believe
you get a red card and you get a red card.
You get a red card. And the handball, which is accurate, the guy's trying to pretend the hand was in front of his body and it just he stuck his hand out. Anyway, I sound like a soccer fan. He gets a red card. So within a matter of like 3 to 5 minutes, 3 red cards, which means 2 guys get pulled off the field. The manager gets kicked off. Manchester United goes on to win 3-1.
Just from penalties?
From one was a penalty, and then they score because they have one more guy on the field, even though they're down. They had one more guy on the field. And I watched that, and of course, me who can't pass up a teaching moment with my kids was like, hey, look at how swiftly, and even the commentators afterwards, right, were like, that was unacceptable. The player who pushed the ref will probably be out anywhere from 4 to 6 games. Back in 1998, a West Ham player was out for 11 games because he pushed a ref. I said, look at how swift they are to defend that there is a hierarchy of respect, because if that guy is allowed to push a ref, the game suddenly becomes whoever is the biggest and whoever's the bully, not talent.
That's a good lesson, Joe.
Not work, not skill. And of course, at that point, we didn't know that the dean, the DEI, I always want to say die. The DEI dean at Stanford.
That's what we should call it.
And so I was contrasting that with the girls to say, there's 2 ways to respond when you don't agree with somebody who particularly is placed in authority over you. You can disagree, but to start pushing, to start yelling, to start shouting down leads to chaos. It doesn't actually lead to any sort of answer. It doesn't lead to you getting your way. I mean, listen, we're trying to teach that to our child, like our 3-year-old, right? Like, you have a meltdown, you're not going to get your way. Like, that's the fastest way to guarantee you get nothing. And so I looked at these 2 situations, and as you and I were talking about them, to say, okay, this is indicative of something bigger, I think, that's happening in society. And it's a symptom of a bigger problem. Now, I appreciate that you have these leaders kind of pushing back to say, no, we don't do that. But the fact that there would even be the thought that you could do this and get your way, I think is problematic.
Agreed.
Yeah. So let's talk about like what do these situations actually speak to? What's the bigger root issue behind what I would say are symptoms?
Well, we are always talking about the fact that we live in a post-Christian culture.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that rejection of God fundamentally kind of probably bled over into a rejection of other authority figures. And just maybe we've been experimenting with this idea of like, maybe we can all just be our own little God, our own little authority, govern ourselves. And you see the culture picking up on that. I mean, now apparently you're supposed to be allowed to determine whether you're a boy or a girl when you're 4. And I think we're forgetting that there's like freedom that comes from being able to look at an authority and take guidance, and to be obedient. There's freedom in that. There's freedom in a child looking to his parent to find out what his identity is. And there's freedom when you're a college student with raging hormones who's never lived away from home, having dorm rules enforced on you so that you don't ruin your own freaking life because you don't know what you're doing. There's freedom in that. And it's hard to see the freedom when you're having the rules imposed on you. But then when you get old, like me and Joe, you can look back and be like, oh, yeah, they saved me from myself a lot. And there's been this period in recent history where there's no one there to save you from yourself. Mm-hmm. And yeah, now we're seeing it in these law school debacles and everything.
Well, and that there's a purpose to have this hierarchy in any culture of kind of who's the top, who's the bottom, not for oppression, not for subjugation, but when you remove God and the idea that there is a higher power to which you are responsible, the whole thing starts to crumble. Because when you have God in place, you understand, hey, I am just a piece in a much bigger story. Mm-hmm. I am not my own God.
Yeah.
Thank goodness.
Thank goodness.
But there's someone bigger than me that I can either rebel against or I can choose to submit to. And then that translates into actually all of our relationships. I think the primary one is parenting. And you even see that in scripture where Paul reminds us in Ephesians, he says, honor your father and mother is the first commandment with a promise. Like we already see right away, this primary relationship actually holds a benefit when you choose to submit. And that promise that we see is, honor your father and mother that it may go well for you. Now, that doesn't mean that your parents are all going to be good parents. I know that some of you listening even may have had parents who abandoned you, who were abusive, who are still toxic. And yet what God is saying is there is a way to honor and respect them, even as you put up boundaries that will lead to your flourishing. And I think because it's our heart that learns how to discern, but also how to submit to authority. And as we grow, we gain wisdom to know, hey, this is not a safe relationship, so I'm going to remove myself versus this is a healthy relationship.
Yeah.
But I think by telling people you're your own God, by telling people that like, hey, your parents are just like kind of your friends and they're just there to guide and direct you and fund your life, we've actually left a whole generation to be a moral wasteland.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's not good for the parents either because I think they know deep down that they do have a responsibility to lead. But the culture's been telling them, well, your role is just to affirm. Affirm whatever crazy idea your 2-year-old has, your 14-year-old has. And we all know there's something not right about this.
Well, we talked about that last week. I think last week we mentioned the governor of Minnesota who said that good parents basically just affirm the kid telling them who they are.
Yeah.
And I just, did you never have kids?
No.
That's all I can think of. Because
I'm convinced these people never did.
I'm like, come spend a day in my life where one child tells me that they are today they're Snow White and tomorrow they're Elsa. And then they're going to be, they're insistent that you call them Ella. That's not their name, P.S. But they're adamant. And then they're this or they're that. And it's cute when you're kids. But as a parent, if I were to affirm everything, my child would be so confused, actually. She would have no idea who she is or what her place is in the world.
Yeah.
Because I'm just like, yeah, sure, whatever you feel like today. I'm like, so when my kid comes to me as an anorexic, I'm supposed to affirm that? because in their mind, their image is that they are fat. And so they're going to start, like, you start to realize this is really unhealthy mentality.
Yeah. You brought up the question of questions. I think a sign of a healthy authority subordinate balance is one where questions are welcomed and answered. And you see that with parents. A bad authoritarian would be if a child asked a question and the parent just said, because I said so, or because if you don't, I'm going to hurt you.
Right.
No, that's not
Correct
helpful.
That's wrong.
Exactly. That's not helpful. That's not helpful. And that's a sign of the authority figure abusing their power or just not leading well. But then there's also relationships between authority and subordination where the person is too afraid to ask a question because they'll either be treated like they're stupid, or the question will be viewed as questioning the person's authority and not actually seeking guidance. So I went to a retreat this last weekend in Alabama. It was amazing at this retreat house called Casa Maria, run by nuns. You can't go wrong when something is run by nuns. And I got so lucky because last minute there was an update to the schedule, and the priest that was the chaplain of my monastery when I was in the monastery became the retreat master of this retreat. I was like, okay, God. Yeah, it was
I
so
love
sweet.
that.
It was good. The retreat was called Finding Healing in the Eucharist. But Father told a story at one point during one of his talks about, and this had never occurred to me before about scripture. Catholics, and I know some other denominations, we kind of view Mary as the new Eve. She kind of corrected all the stuff that Eve did wrong. And he pointed out that when it comes to authority, Mary, when Gabriel came to her view of authority wasn't just, well, there's this messenger from God here, so I better just shut up and do whatever he says. Even though we think she was like the holiest woman who ever lived, what did she do when Gabriel came to her and asked her to be the mother of God? She asked questions, and Gabriel answered them. And it wasn't until they got clarity together that she was like, okay, let's do this thing. He contrasted that with Eve, who, when presented with the apple in the Garden of Eden by Satan, didn't ask any questions. The appropriate question in that circumstance would have been like, because, they had a conversational friendship with God, Adam and Eve. It would have been to be like, hey, God, who's this guy? And is what he's saying true? That didn't happen. And so this was a bad authority situation. And I found that really clarifying. And just we have to deal with authorities even as adults when we're out of our parents' authority. We're going to have bosses. We're going to have church leaders. We're going to have maybe friendships where one friend is more dominant than the other. And I think a good red flag for any relationship is if you can't ask a question and get your genuine questions answered and clarified, then there's an issue there.
Well, look at how quickly, as you're saying that, I think, look at how quickly Eve replaced good authority for bad authority. Mm-hmm. And she had the perfect authority, and she quickly abandoned it. And, living in this world, aside from God, every authority that we come under is going to be flawed.
Yes.
But there's a wisdom, discernment, and a maturity in being able to acknowledge that everybody is flawed. And even with those flaws, can we still follow them? Mm-hmm. Can we still learn from them? And I do think it separates, like, there are abusive parents, there are abusive leaders, there are dictators. We could go down the line of what's going on right now around the world. And so part of that is that wisdom and discernment, but it makes that quote from the Spanish philosopher. I love these Spanish philosopher, George Santayana.
Joe lived in Spain, if you didn't know that.
Oh yeah. And I speak to my kids in Spanish. Fun fact. But he said, and we've all heard this one, those who cannot learn from history are doomed to repeat it. And you see that happening, right? As they're tearing down statues right now around the country, and they're wanting to rename schools, and they're wanting to erase everything that is our history. And the idea is that, well, there's things that were so bad that we just can't talk about it. But by not talking about it, you actually set yourself up to repeat it by trying to silence versus, and we've talked about this on our podcast before, coming back with better ideas. Mm-hmm. You don't need to silence. you should counter them with better ideas. So those Stanford students, rather than screaming down a federal judge, could have, to take Mary's example, respectfully asked questions, countered with what they might have considered better ideas or arguments, or maybe realized, I don't know what I'm talking about.
Yeah, there's wisdom in knowing that you don't know anything.
Yes. And it sadly comes with age, I think. I don't know a lot of you. I was not in my 20s somebody who was like, man, I know nothing. The older I get, the more I realize what I don't know.
Yeah.
And I hope it puts me in a more teachable position to say, help me. Like, I just want to understand that, which I think is always why it's so disappointing when we ask someone like, explain to me why you believe this. I'm not trying to argue. I just want to know. And they don't want to have that conversation. And increasingly, we're seeing this in some pockets. I'm not going to ascribe it to an entire political group or side, but yeah, I think that that's a great point to say, hey, in asking questions, there's a way to ask questions that is respectful. And if you can't, that's a good indicator too of like, what is the dynamic of this relationship?
Yeah.
I mean, as parents, that's part of our struggle right now, right? Used to be, you just sort of said like, listen to your teachers, show them respect, but depending on where your kids are at, or if at some point you send your kids, I'm going to say specifically to the public school, that's not a given that you can trust that you can just say, hey, whatever your teacher says, we need to listen, we need to obey, we need to follow, respect, blah, blah, blah. Because there's stuff entering the schools through teachers that is so harmful for our kids, that is so not true. And so that is the tension right now, is how do we raise our children? How do we ourselves be people that respect and honor authority while also knowing and being able to discern when it's not authority that should be followed?
Yeah. And we have to recognize, especially as parents, those who are parents, we cannot outsource our parenting. Have to brag on Jose for a second. We got an email from one of my kids, who shall remain unnamed, teacher this morning, and he was being mean to a classmate, like mean enough that we got an email about it. And she said, I want to let you know so you can help from home. And he's going to be spoken to by the principal. And I'm reading this email like, this kid? Because this is not the kid I would have thought I was going to get an email about. And I showed it to Jose. He cancels his work meetings, drops everything, and drives to the school, pulled the kid out of class, and had a conversation with him. Not a physical altercation with him, but a conversation to reinforce what the teacher had said, make it really clear that this is not okay. We're not doing this. He didn't even wait for this kid to be sent home. He just went to the school and did it. And I thought, that is really good parenting. It wouldn't have occurred to me to like drop everything and go and have that conversation right this second. But he did, because he recognizes I can't outsource something like this to a teacher or a principal. Like, I need to be involved right now. And thankfully, we are in a district where that is very welcome. There's probably districts where they would be like, oh, we got this. You could wait until your child comes home. But he didn't. And I really appreciated that witness today. Just an example of authority in my morning. Yeah.
And a healthy authority is actually loving, because it's stepping into that child's life to say, hey, I'm not going to ignore this because of who you could become. I don't want you to become a kid who's protesting at Stanford Law and potentially throwing away your future because you didn't learn how to handle your disagreements.
Yeah.
I don't want you to be a kid who becomes the adult who shoves a ref because you didn't learn how to control your frustration and your anger.
Exactly. You made a point earlier about, I think you said about how some authority is flawed, and you talked about, dictators. I want to make it really clear that those people are going to have to answer for God for how they misled anyone subordinated to them, because, it says in Scripture that if you mislead one of these little ones and drag them astray, it'd be better for you that a millstone be hung around your neck and you'd be drowned in the ocean. So when we talk about authority, I feel like a lot of times we're talking about obedience and our need to listen to authority. But just as importantly, we also need to talk about the expectation that God has of authority figures, because like Jesus tells, I think it's Pilate or Herod, he says, you would have no authority if it didn't come to you from my Father. The only reason anyone has authority is because it's entrusted to them. And then some people usurp authority that's not entrusted to them at all. And so, as you may not be surprised to hear, the Catechism has a couple good things to say about authority. I would recommend, if you want to look this up, if you have a catechism, either Google it or go to the back in the index thing and look up authority, because the passages on authority are all over the place. They're not all in one section. But one of these quotes I wanted to share is paragraph 1898. It says, every human community needs an authority to govern it. The foundation of such authority lies in human nature. We need to be governed. It is necessary for the unity of the state. And its role is to ensure, as far as possible, the common good of society. I think those are some really good guideposts. One, recognizing our human nature is not such that we can govern ourselves. We're not automatons, however you say that, floating through the world who will be just fine on our own. Children are not born and you just be like, okay, now you're out of the womb, go off and do your thing. We at every stage of our life need to be guided because of our human nature, but then also just because of the way societies work and the way humans interact. There has to be governing powers over groups of humans anytime a group of humans is together too. And just recognizing that because some of us have libertarian tendencies, God's not really a libertarian. He recognizes the need for us to be governed. And so I think it's good to hear what the church kind of has to say about that. And then paragraph 2235, I'm not going to read it. And following, this is on the duty of civil authorities, which is very relevant right now because a lot of civil authorities in our country specifically are taking on roles that are not proper to them. They're overstepping their authority. And then some of them are usurping it and not doing things like policing the border that they're supposed to be doing. So,
says the woman who lives in Texas.
I live in Texas. I don't know if you know this, but the border is a federal issue that Texas as a state can only do so much about. So there you go.
And the border, by the way, folks, extends beyond Texas. Other states there.
Whatever.
But anyway, that makes me think of the James Madison quote in I think it was the Federalist Papers, where he says, if men were angels, there would be no need for government.
Yeah.
And if angels governed men, you would need no restraints on government. And so it's even actually built into the fabric of our nation because at the time, there was an understanding of how human nature works and also how the universe works in terms of there being a creator God who he himself is the authority. And from that, goodness and justice and freedom actually flow because he is a just authority figure. And then that we are flawed and that we need different levels of authority. As a child, you need a parent, and even when you get older, your parents still have a role to play and they can still be a blessing to you. Again, depending on the parent dynamics and then the boss, employer and government, all these things, but also understanding all of that is meant to have limits because we ourselves are flawed. So just because you get elected to office doesn't make you a better person. In fact, there's some who would argue we're getting the worst of the worst right now.
I recently heard somebody say that you wouldn't run for office if you weren't a narcissist. And I thought that's a pretty big generalization. That's also mostly true.
Right. And so I think this comes down to, to bring it full circle on our conversation about honor and respect and authority, understanding our own human nature, understanding who each of us is at our very core, not to despise it, but to also show restraint, to put those parameters around so that you can live a life that is abundant, so that you can live a life that is free from unnecessary suffering that you inflict on yourself, as we point out in some of those stories at the beginning. But part of that, actually a big part of it, comes from knowing your place in the world in the sense that there is a God, and someday you will stand before him and you will be held accountable for the choices that you have made, for the way that you have led whoever was placed under your authority. And that should keep us in a place of humility, in a place of wanting to learn, a place of always seeking that God be our source for how we lead. And so again, pull God out and the whole thing falls apart. Put God back in and you have a way to orient yourself, your life, society towards actual freedom and liberty, justice, happiness, all the things. Should I just start quoting the Constitution? I could.
Yes.
I won't. Okay, friends, thank you. Hopefully the sound was good.
We should go listen to it right after this and see if we need a re-record.
We'd love to hear from you all. Wildandbeautifulpodcast@gmail.com. And as always, stay wild and beautiful until we talk to you next week.